All right. Thank you so much. Welcome to another episode of the Sales Story and a Tip podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. Of course, I'm the co founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales, and I'm also the host of the Sales Game Changers podcast. And I'm excited. We have one of our Sales Game Changers podcast guests on the show today, David Peed. You could watch the Sales Story and a Tip podcast on YouTube. And of course, you could listen to it wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a 5-star review. If you're watching this on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. All right, I'm very excited today. Again, I mentioned my guest today, David Peed, was on the Sales Game Changers podcast and had a great conversation with him. And I'm looking forward to his sales story today. David, why don't you give us a brief introduction to the audience?
Absolutely, Fred. It's always great to see you. My name's Dave Peed. I currently am responsible for the indirect channel market for Comcast Government Solutions, which is a entity underneath Comcast Business. Career government contractor, absent 3 months. 3 years. I work for the U.S. House of Representatives, and as you know, I've spanned across multiple different verticals, including the telecom, cloud platform, and cybersecurity, and until recently, being here at Comcast Business.
All right, David Peed, tell us a great sales story.
Fred, when we first talked about this, I thought long and hard. And as you know, I'm an avid horse racing fan. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to do a trifecta of a story, which is, as you know, it means three. And at the racetrack, it means you're betting the first three horses. But I thought there were three stories that I could talk about that would help the audience and also leave them with some advice. First, and I'll leave the person nameless. When I was at Siena, and the moral of the story is it is important what you do outside of work. And I know you've shared with many about your passion for understanding and help people with Lyme disease. But at Siena, a big sell-through was to tier one carriers, and there was one in particular I did not have a foothold in, and it was at Verizon. And I'll leave the person uh, out of it, but I was coaching football for 10 years for both my sons, head coaching both the teams. And in this one particular weekend, I saw this guy. Actually, he wasn't there, but I was coaching against a team, and they had a girl on the team, and she was a phenomenal athlete. And as I would do for any athlete, but especially since she was the only woman on the field, I gave her lots of words of encouragement, cheering for her, cheering her on when she make a great play. So I'm at a conference later on, maybe a few months after, and I see this guy in line, and he said, "Hey, you coach football in Ellicott City?" And I go, "I certainly do." And he goes, "You coached against my daughter, and you encouraged her and cheered for her more than her own coach did." And I was really amazed at how disciplined and how organized your team was, but most importantly, the impact you had in my daughter, with my daughter. It just made her day. And she thought it was pretty cool that the opposite coach, the opposing team's coach, was so encouraging. Um, and that just to say, not just be a good person, Fred, but it really does mean and touch at, you just never know where or how you're going to get an intro uh, into an organization, into a government, wherever it is. It could be the place you least expect it. And this person was gracious enough to give me some time for a meeting. And as always, you have to have something meaningful to say and meaningful to present when you get those opportunities. But sometimes those opportunities are won or lost or found in a way you just never thought of. And I would argue, especially in the DC metropolitan area, whether you're in the Columbia area or Northern Virginia, uh, sports uh, and and the environment, but places like, but most importantly, when you're dealing with youth sports, you just never know who you're going to run into. So and that really is the message of, get involved community, obviously be a good person, but you just never know when you're going to, meet somebody important. That's one. Second story is there was a non-for-profit that I was on a board, advisory board for. And even at a nonprofit, it's important for them to grow. And the young man who was running business development for them was trying to close in on a sale. And he called me one day and he said, "Dave, I'm really struggling with the pace of how I interact with this potential client." And my advice, and I'll leave this with the audience as well. I said, "Christian, chasing a sale and trying to follow up on leads is very similar to when you meet a girl in high school and you really want to date this girl, and somehow you cross paths, you get a phone number. I'm like, hey, if you call every day, that's probably not a good thing. And if you don't call for a couple weeks, that's probably not a good thing. And if you call a couple times and you don't get a return call, it's probably some insight into that the person is, for whatever reason, not interested and not even willing to make that extra or take that time to meet with you. But oddly enough, Fred, I think it's my advice and the nugget I would have here is kind of as some of the newer members of the audience are going through this, and you're trying to pace the play of cadence of, when you meet a first contact, you meet a government, when it's government employee, or whether if you're outside the government sales, you meet somebody, a good thing to remember if you're a male, if it's a female, vice versa, is the interaction you would have with somebody when you're just trying to start off a personal relationship is really what you're looking for. The same thing in business. If you wouldn't say something in your personal life, it's probably not appropriate to say and in your personal life, it's probably not appropriate to say in business. And the cadence and pace of play of how you would interact with somebody on the personal side is really relevant on the business side. There's usually something there. And I'll tie in the third story that is, and actually will help, I think, with that as well. Um, my wife and I have a wonderful relationship, married for almost 25 years. And for my whole life, we'll talk once a day. My wife is not she's not one that, I like to say we live in a very narrow band where the highs don't get too highs and the lows don't get too lows. And for 25 years, I've done this, 23 or 4 years, I've done a golf tournament with a group of about 20 guys that really I helped put together years and years ago when I was running Quest Federal, before it became CenturyLink, before it became Lumen, the sales there. And we had acquired US West, and we were going to do a golf tournament to build camaraderie between the new folks that came on board from US West and the folks that were resisting from the classic Quest side. And for whatever reason, the folks from US West couldn't make it out. But we still did the golf trip, and always go out. I'm an early bird, so it's not likely that I'm out past 9 or 10. But this one particular evening, I had a few cocktails. Not a social nuisance, but I had a few cocktails. And the next morning, 6:30, 7 o'clock, I'm waiting for time to click by before I call my wife for a conversation. I thought, oh, I forgot to call my wife. Uh, and I call her that morning once it got to a decent hour. And I said, honey, I'm so sorry. I forgot to call you yesterday. And she said, David, we talked for 20 minutes last night, and it obviously had slipped my mind. I wasn't uh, inebriated, but old age stinks. Um, and I learned a valuable lesson with that, Fred, and I think it's carried on in my personal life and professional life ever since. And the message is, don't apologize or don't be sorry for something until you've done something wrong. And it really is that one incident with my wife where, just busy the day and totally forgot, but I made that phone call. And I've used that so many times in business, Fred, where your initial reaction is to, and especially as type A's and people who are really aggressive, and you're like, go get that sale and close that deal. And my advice to the audience is, hey, there's been times in my career where I've thought about reaching out and maybe, inquiring about something, or maybe, have I done something wrong, or was that presentation okay? And my message really is take a deep breath, give it some time, have some patience. And in essence, in the story about the golfing, I, in essence, don't apologize till you know you're wrong. So the message, I should have waited for my wife to yell at me for not calling the day before. Then I could have apologized, and everybody would have been fine. But it really is I think it's something I've used in my personal life, and I've also used in business. It's just, be patient, wait that extra little bit of time before you overreact to a situation, to say, hey, maybe you, and in essence, you resubmit a proposal, or you send an email lapping over top to something you've already sent, and maybe you just never really needed to send it. So hopefully that.
Absolutely. So those are three great angles there. One is, definitely want to be interesting, and definitely you want to not seem over anxious, but you don't want to seem under anxious. And when the customer doesn't call you back, when it's going on 3 or 4 months, you need to think of another angle to get in there, because there's still probably a good reason for the you to serve. And I like the concept also of not apologizing. People a lot of times they'll start phone calls with, am I bothering you, or is this a bad time? Well, like you said, wait for them to come back at you. David P, those are some great angles. Give us one tip that you learned from those three to end today's sales story and a tip podcast.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest tip I can say, and it's for me, whether it's OCD or impatient, it just take a deep breath, give it some time. You want to be thorough in your follow up. You want to be, timing wise, you want to make sure that you hit all the marks there. But there's nothing wrong with taking a little time, showing a little patience, and letting, in essence, the customer or the person you're interacting with, give them some time.
Yeah, and if it's a good fit, if it makes sense, they're going to come back to you, and especially if they're an existing customer. Sometimes if they may not return your calls right away, you go into your mind, and you go into your head, and you think of things, and the reality is, maybe, you know, who knows? It doesn't really matter. I've had some of those situations too, and then like all of a sudden, out of the blue, the customer will come back and say, "Hey, we're ready. Sorry, we've been dealing with some internal things, so we don't always know what's going on." All right. Once again, this is the Sales Story and a Tip podcast. I want to thank my guest, David Peed. You could watch all of the previous episodes on YouTube, and you could download the audios on Apple Podcasts. Thanks to David Peed. My name is Fred Diamond. Again, this is the Sales Story and a Tip podcast.